In this lecture, we're going to examine the action potential, and in doing so, we begin with the foundation of human movement, which is the neuromuscular system. And the neuromuscular system foundation is in the spinal cord. The somatic nervous system refers to that portion of the nervous system that is under voluntary control. So what we're looking at here in this drawing is the cross-section of a spinal cord, and we have two separate nerve roots that are part of that central nervous system, and we have this very long axon that terminates into voluntary skeletal muscle. So we have different parts of the spinal cord that we reviewed before, but it's worth mentioning again. This anterior side is referred to as the ventral side, and the darkened appearance, the darkened area here is called the gray matter, and the gray matter is has this appearance because it is composed of a large number of neuron cell bodies, and those cell bodies yield a particular type of shading to the spinal cord. We see that the cell body for the motor neuron is housed in the ventral horn of the gray matter in the spinal cord, and it's this cell body that needs to be activated in order to generate an electrical signal down the axon in order to turn on that muscle, that skeletal muscle, so that skeletal muscle can produce force. And in this unit, we're going to examine the specific physiological mechanisms on how that electrical impulse is generated. The posterior or dorsal side of the spinal cord is the pathway for entry of sensory information. So motor information exits the spinal cord on the anterior or the ventral side, and sensory information comes in on the dorsal or posterior side. This enlarged part of the nerve root on the dorsal side is called the DRG, the dorsal root ganglion, and this is where the cell bodies for the sensory neurons are located. They're not located in the spinal cord like we see with the motor neuron cell bodies. Now, in focusing on the motor side, and that's the side that activates the motors of the human body, which is skeletal muscle, here we see in this drawing three different motor neurons. Now, there are many more motor neurons than this that reside within the ventral horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord, but here in this picture, we're going to illustrate just three of them. And so we have, according to the colors here, we have this light blue, which is motor neuron number 1. The red is motor neuron number 2. And the dark blue is motor neuron number 3. And you see that the long axons will extend and basically plug into a number of different muscle fibers. So what we have here on the bottom are the individual muscle fibers that are specific to a single motor neuron. So we don't have one motor neuron, or we don't have motor neurons that cross other motor neurons. So one motor neuron will innervate a certain number of muscle fibers, and another motor neuron will innervate different muscle fibers. And these are indicated by these colors. A new term here is called the motor unit. And the motor unit is a term that refers to a single motor neuron, could be any one of these three, and all of the muscle fibers it innervates. So if we take a look at the red one here, right here in the middle, motor neuron number 2, and we follow that motor neuron axon, we find that it branches and it will innervate or plug into 1, 2, 3 muscle fibers. Those 3 muscle fibers and the motor neuron that originates in the spinal cord is called the motor unit. And these somatic motor neurons are the ones that innervate and control skeletal muscle. So one motor neuron innervates many muscle fibers, but it's important to note that that number does vary considerably. Now, stated a little bit differently here, each muscle fiber is innervated by only one motor neuron. So if we take a look at this red muscle fiber right here, we see that it's innervated only by that red motor neuron, not by either one of these two blue motor neurons. So just to summarize some of the basic facts on the somatic nervous system, this all begins at a synapse between this all involves a synapse, a gap between the motor neuron and a muscle fiber. And that occurs in the muscle at the site called the neuromuscular junction. The end of the axon that meets a muscle fiber is called the terminal button, or just simply the axon terminal. The term motor end plate refers to skeletal muscle tissue, and that's the portion of the muscle cell that receives that plug-in from that terminal axon. So that's the point of an anatomical connection between those two structures. The neurotransmitter released by the terminal axon of the motor neuron is acetylcholine. And so all motor neurons that extend to skeletal muscle will release acetylcholine. All synapses at the neuromuscular junction are excitatory. So we do not have inhibitory types of connections here. They're all excitatory. So when an alpha motor neuron is turned on, it will activate all the muscle fibers that it is plugged into. The receptors for acetylcholine, and these are specialized proteins on the muscle buried within the muscle fiber membrane, these are classified as nicotinic cholinergic receptors. And the definition of these will be explored in a subsequent unit on the autonomic nervous system. And the terms are given based upon the chemical properties of those proteins that serve as receptors. Another protein that's found on the muscle fiber membrane that is in close proximity to the terminal axon is a protein called acetylcholine esterase. Now, if we take a look at the last three letters, ASE, this tells us this is a protein that functions as an enzyme. And this is an enzyme that's found what's called in the postsynaptic membrane, which is the muscle fiber. It's buried within the membrane of the muscle fiber. And this is an enzyme that will accelerate the breaking up of the neurotransmitters. So acetylcholine is the excitatory neurotransmitter, but that muscle fiber will remain excited until it's shut off. And what shuts it off is the acetylcholine esterase enzyme. In terms of motor neuron activation, that begins up in the spinal cord. Now, activation of the motor neuron is subject to either EPSPs or IPSPs, or both at the same time. The EPSP comes by way of other neurons that will excite the motor neuron up in the spinal cord. The IPSPs come from other neurons that will inhibit that activation of the alpha motor neuron. The resulting action of the alpha motor neuron, whether it turns on or it does not turn on, will depend on how all of these inputs will add up. If there are more excitatory inputs, the motor neuron will activate. If there are more inhibitory inputs, the motor neuron will stay locked, will not activate. So the release of acetylcholine on the other end of the neuron, down in the muscle, the terminal end, is caused by the axon action potential, and that the mechanisms of the action potential is something that we'll address in this unit as well. And so this causes what's referred to as an electrical to chemical event. The action potential, as I will describe in the next few videos, is an electrical event. The electrical event will trigger a chemical event. That chemical event is the release of the neurotransmitter from the terminal axon that will then activate the skeletal muscle fiber at what's called the motor end plate. So that specialized region of muscle fiber membrane in close proximity to the terminal axon will generate what's called an end plate potential. It is an action potential that is very similar to the action potentials that's occurring across the motor neuron axon, but this one is so named because of where it occurs, and it occurs at that specialized region of the membrane in close proximity to the terminal axon at the neuromuscular junction. So this ends our first part of Unit 3.